Hello, hello. Hey, Jules. Jules. Good. I am good. Hey, Olu. There's my guest. Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Becky Brown Girl Show. I am your host, Becky Brown Girl. And I know it's been a minute since I've seen y'all. But tonight we're talking the 2024 presidential election part two. It's part two because I had my guest that I will have on this evening on back in July, Thomas Varela, Executive Director of the New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition. He was so popular with the viewers that they're like, you got to bring him back. So, we've spoken in between time and thought it would be helpful to have him back on closer to the election. And now we're under 2 weeks away, so he's back. Before I add him, I just wanted to emphasize, first of all, that this is going to be a nonpartisan conversation. Now, Thomas will be here representing his organization. I'm here representing me, so I will do my best to remain neutral, right? We're going to be covering a few different areas, but I'd like to say, I know some people feel like they don't want to talk about politics. It's too controversial, it gets too contentious. People have different points of view and ideologies, but whether or not you do politics does you. So it's better to be engaged and aware of what's happening around you because it will impact you whether you care or not, right? With that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Thomas Varela. Varela, is the executive director of the New Jersey Empowerment Coalition, as I said before. New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition is a statewide nonprofit organization at the intersection of policy, inclusive democracy, and active citizenship working towards racial justice in New Jersey. This organization educates key stakeholders and the broader public about relevant policy issues, encouraging active citizenship and voter participation to achieve sustainable change. So let me go ahead and add him. Hopefully. Talking about politics, and quite frankly, I said I wasn't going to touch it anymore because I think he's there. Well, hopefully he's there. Are you there? Hi.
Hey, what's going on?
Welcome. Let me turn up my volume here. Okay, so now that I've done your formal introduction, if there's anything else that you'd like to add about yourself that I didn't touch on in your bio, please feel free.
No, I think that covered it. Definitely appreciate you bringing me back on. Appreciate the opportunity to continue to talk about the importance of civic participation, particularly for Black and Brown communities, where in this moment it's really critical that we understand the power of our vote. And, as you highlighted, we're a nonpartisan organization. And so it's really important that, for us, we recognize that regardless of political party, what does it mean when Black people vote in all elections? What does it mean when Black people attend school board meetings, they go to city council meetings, and that they participate in all facets of government? And so looking forward to the conversation.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Like I said, you are a popular guest, so you
That's what's
are
up.
back by popular demand.
Okay, that's what's up. That's
um,
what's up. It's always that topic is always interesting on the one hand, right? Because obviously it's an election season, but typically when you talk about government, it's not really sexy. So it's good to hear that people are interested in this kind of work.
well, I know you're gonna make it a sexy conversation tonight.
No doubt.
Hopefully. Anyway, so we're going to touch on three kind of main topic areas. One is going to be about creating a voting plan. So, early voting has begun, I believe, in 47 states,
Mm-hmm.
is what I read. And it's the I guess time frame of what's considered early voting and how you can go about doing it varies from state to state. So you definitely need to check within your state and your respective like community,
Yeah.
county, whatever your districts are called, right? Where you reside, but or I should say where you're registered. And then we want to talk about the party platforms of Harris and Trump, and then why it's important to remain civically engaged post-election season, um, and how you can go about doing that. So let's start with the first topic of assuming you all are registered to vote. It's too late for folks to register at this point, isn't it?
It depends. I know in New Jersey it's too late. The deadline in New Jersey was October 15th. I know in Pennsylvania the deadline was actually this past Monday. So what is it, the
Mhm.
21st? I think New York is the 26th. So to that point, there are some states that you may be able to still register to vote, but for the most part, I know in New Jersey it is the deadline has passed. So that's typically step one when you think about making your voter plan is to confirm that you are able to vote. And so I would definitely encourage people to check their county website in order to make sure that they're in the system, and hopefully they are, because like we said, in some cases if they miss the deadline then it's hard to register for this election, but they can still register for the next election. So for instance, in New Jersey, we have on our website, it redirects, if you go to www.njbec.org, we have a section where you can, it's our voter center, voter action center, where people can visit that site and find the relevant links that redirects to the State Department's website so that they can go through those prompts. So definitely at this point, when we think about your voter plan, step one, folks should be registered and they may want to go check, or yeah, like they at this point they need to register if they haven't already, if their state allows it.
I hope y'all already registered.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely.
um You know what? Before we get into your voting plan, I'd like you to reiterate why it's important for people to vote again. Like people just hear, oh, you should go out and vote. Your ancestors bled and died, which is, a BFD, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's a great reason on its own, right? But aside from that, I'd like you to talk more practically about why it matters.
No, definitely. Voting is just the way that you talk to your government, right? So we're a country of 330 billion people. Many times is um, your government is doing these things on behalf of its citizens, and typically it is responding to the needs of the voters. So in that point, um, you're voting because that's part of the process of trying to keep your government accountable. In some cases, people will make voting feel like it's the only thing you need to do. So that's not the case, because it's step one of all these different things that you could be doing in terms of advocacy. But it is a critical component because elected officials, they work on behalf of the citizens, and it's up to the voters to determine if an elected official should stay in their seat or someone else should be in their seat. And so voting is critical from the vantage point of it's your way of communicating to your government how you feel about the candidates that are supposed to be representing you. And so the candidates, obviously we have the presidential. So you have your candidates that are representing you on a federal level, and then you have your state representatives that represent you on a state level, or your U.S. representatives that represent you on a federal level, and then you have your mayor and your city council that represents you on a local level. So ultimately, when you do vote, it's your way of letting your government know that these are the things you care about. And I would also say the reason that you also vote from a strategic standpoint is because when campaigns try to determine who they want to focus on, they will look at the voter roll and the voter turnout to kind of determine where they want to go. And so an example, whenever you see candidates show up in October to the local churches, they're doing that many times because they know the church people vote. When they engage with fraternities and sororities, or when they engage with your local active organizations, they will typically target the people who vote because there's a science behind campaigns, right? Each voter or potential voter costs an amount of money. Let's say, I don't know, $1,000. I'm just making up a number, right? There's 2 steps in the process. Step 1 is if I'm a non-voter, and let's say you are part of a campaign trying to like get me to vote for you. Step 1, you have to ask me, or you have to figure out, am I actually a voter or not? And so if my voting record is inconsistent, that means I don't vote in every election. And so now you as the campaign are going to have to spend money to just convince me to vote, because clearly I show a record of, yeah, I don't vote all the time. I don't vote in this election. I missed that election, whatever. So now you got to spend money to convince me to vote. And then once you convince me to vote, now you got to spend money to convince me to vote for you, right? So that's 2 steps. Versus when you're a super voter, the campaign is already making the calculation. All right, I don't have to spend money to convince this person to vote. They already know the importance of voting. They're going to vote in all elections. So what I will do is just spend money to convince them to vote for me. And so at the end of the day, as a campaign, if you have limited money, you're going to be more inclined to look for people who already vote because they're actually cheaper. And typically, when a campaign is chasing non-consistent voters, there's one of 2 things. One, you're actually trying to mobilize a new audience of people to potentially support you, or you are recognizing that the spaces that you typically go to, you've already tapped out. Like there's no more votes that exist, right? Because if you go to like the churches, there's only so many churches you can speak to. There's only so many people that are there. And if you're a campaign that's typically, if you're struggling in some way, then you have to identify new voters. So you now have to spend more money to convince new voters.
Exactly. And again, I think you touched on this point already, but they're not going to care about what's important to you if you're not in their face. Not only that you're in their face, but then you show up at the poll, right? Because I don't know if you made the point just now or on the previous episode, but no, Black people are not monolithic. So we have different value systems, we have different ideologies, we have different beliefs. That's why, you have folks who are planning to vote for, either candidate. So they're kind of across the spectrum. But if all you do is complain about what people aren't doing and then don't go to the poll to cast your vote and say, I don't like the job you're doing, or I do like the job you're doing, then they don't care about what matters to you. The squeakiest wheel gets the oil. Always, 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 always. So
Yeah, no, definitely. I think one of the things that we always have to remember is that hope is an emotion that can motivate you to vote. Fear or anger is an emotion that can encourage you to vote, right? But the emotion that's actually the worst when we think about civic participation is apathy. Once a community is like, nah, forget this, I'm just throwing my hands up, I'm just going to focus on whatever else I want to focus on, that is what the powers that be want. Because at the end of the day, as you said, the government's still going to cook. Government's still going to do their thing. They're going to still take our tax money. They're going to still do this, that, and the third. And so if we're not participating, then we're not creating another layer of accountability to just kind of like eyes and ears on what's happening, right? A simpler way to think about it, at its purest sense, the elected officials work on our behalf. So we're their boss. And so you should want to vote because that's your way to provide accountability to that elected official, right? If that person's doing well, you give them a good progress report by your vote. If that candidate isn't doing well, you give them a bad progress report by not voting for them. And so at the end of the day, if we relinquish that power, then the chessboards kind of recalibrate, and it kind of pivots back to the people who actually do vote, because at the end of the day, they're able to then provide the progress report for the candidates.
Exactly. And the people who are doing the voting, their priorities might not align with yours. So
Yeah.
again, they're only going to focus on those who are in their face, who are voting, who are following up, who are calling their offices, who are emailing, who are essentially harassing them, right? Because they're the people who are going to put them in office. You complaining on the sideline about what's happening or what's not happening, or thinking, oh, well, does it matter if I vote or not? It doesn't affect me. It affects you whether you vote or not,
Yeah.
right? So have a say. Anyway.
No, definitely. Yeah, no, definitely. And, it's really about using the levers that elected officials respond to get their attention about the issues that you want them to know about.
Exactly. So, okay, so I want you to talk a little bit more about the planning your vote.
Yeah.
Right. So assuming that I did put a poll in the post to promote the show, asking people if they had already voted or would vote early, or whether they plan to wait until election day. Now, I will say traditionally, I wait until election day. I feel like I go into the booth and I, cast my vote for my preferred candidate and candidates. And it just feels for me, it always felt more official. Now, having said that, during the pandemic, the only option that was available was mail-in voting. So all forms of voting, right,
Um,
are good.
yeah, everything is open.
Oh.
Voting is outside, as they would say.
um, and when I did it that way, I was able to track my vote. I know other folks who've already cast their votes in other states, and they did it by mail-in ballot, and they're able to track to confirm it was received. So no shenanigans, right?
Yep, yep.
So it's really up to the individual, and I also think that maybe waiting is not the best case scenario, because you don't want to find yourself in a situation where something else comes up, that takes precedence over voting, which is, in my opinion, and I think in Thomas's opinion, is really critical. Um, so if you think you're inclined to, have an excuse come election day, then get that vote in early. But maybe again, you want to talk more about what options are available to folks that you know of.
Yeah, no, definitely. So we talked about step one, that's registering to vote. If you're registered or not, you want to make sure you do that. You do want to check your voting options, right? And so there's early voting. In some cases, there are people, as you acknowledge, that are already voting. There are certain dates that exist as it relates to early voting. I know in New Jersey, it starts October 26th, which is a Saturday. And so many individuals will take advantage of that. I know historically you will find the Black community, particularly those that are in the church community, they have this common phrase called souls to the poll, where they may leverage the church on Sunday to be that call to action to go vote. And so typically you want to check your voting status in terms of if you want to vote early, and then the other layer is, do you plan to vote by mail, right? And so there's some folks that you can vote early and vote by mail, meaning that you can drop off your ballot early. There are some folks that will vote by mail, but then drop off their ballot like closer to the deadline. And then there are some states that will allow you to vote in a machine early. And so you do want to check to make sure that what your state will allow, and typically you'll check the county website to determine that. And so that's why it's really important that we think about, folks got to think about their plan and what feels more comfortable. Now, after COVID and the pandemic, yes, people have considered mail-in voting. Historically, older people were more comfortable with voting in person because of some of the historic nature that you talked about. You want to make sure that you got the receipt, that vote counted. You want to see it. You want to make sure you pull the, you want to make sure you pull the ballot, whatever. I mean, you pull the lever. I think COVID kind of changed things where older people are starting to recognize that, maybe it is good for me to vote by mail because it's more comfortable. It gives me more time to maybe research the candidates because I have the ballot in front of me, things like that. And then, like you said, they can kind of track it. And so, it's really important. I think one of the things I would encourage people to, one thing to always keep in mind, if you have a mail-in ballot and you are voting and that ballot, you still have that ballot closer to the deadline, you will want to make sure to put your ballot in an official election commissioner mailbox or drop it off at the commissioner's office directly or whoever is the title of the person that handles voting. And so what do I mean by that? In some cases, as you get closer to the voting deadline, yes, you can put it in the ballot, like you can put it in the mail and it should arrive. But what happens is if you get closer to the deadline, you run the risk that that ballot may not arrive by the deadline because it gets caught up in the mail system, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously we know, the mail-in system, it could take a day, in many cases it could take a day or two. In some cases it could be quick, right? Because they see that it's an official ballot, so they'll know to move quickly. Mm-hmm. But you don't want to run the risk that it's in the mail-in system and it gets there after the deadline. So I would definitely encourage you, if you know you're going to vote by mail and you already know who you want to vote for, like you're not undecided in any way, then you should vote as soon as possible because it allows you to just put it in the system and get it checked and not worry about that. You know what I mean? But if you're still doing your research, then of course do your research. But do keep in mind that as you get closer to the deadline, November 5th, it is better to put your ballot in the official county ballot mailbox or drop it off at their office directly so that you don't get caught slipping where your ballot doesn't make it.
That part, because, yes.
Yeah.
Because it's important, right? You want to make sure you counted, right? There was something I wanted to piggyback off.
Yeah, I see a comment. There's still people researching.
Well,
I mean, I know.
I
know some people
touch on that.
Yeah.
Right? Because I feel look, so the last time you and I spoke, Biden was still the Democratic nominee, right?
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, that's crazy. We haven't connected since then. That's kind of wild.
Well, not through here.
No, in that regard, so much has changed when we think about that.
No, for sure, but I feel like people who are saying at this point, once again, I understand that everyone is not politically inclined, politically savvy. I feel like even if you don't want to pay attention to it, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous, right? So for people who do not watch traditional news or cable news or whatever, they're probably on, social media. They're going to see it somewhere online. You're going to see something. You're going to see, clickbait. You're going to see a headline. You're going to see something about the candidates, right? And I'm not suggesting that the internet is not a good place to get your information and that's your primary source. I am saying that you probably need to check a few different reputable websites, right? Go to the candidates' platforms, right, to understand what it is that they represent. Because depending on who's communicating the message, if they're communicating it about the candidate, it may not be necessarily what the candidate intended. They might take a soundbite, of something that was. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Into something else. So it's important for you to do your own research, right? But I do kind of feel like at this point, how you gonna say you don't know? I mean, do you know, or do you not know, or do you just not want to say?
Yeah, I think
I feel like that's what it is.
Yeah, I think it sounds, my opinion. I think it sounds kind of it can give off a certain sense of I am doing my due diligence to determine who's the best candidate. I'm still kind of on the fence. And yes, there are some people that are thinking like that, so you don't want to dismiss it. But I do think while there are some people that will be still on the fence, there are many people that it sounds good to be able to say, I'm still being courted, right? And so, at the end of the day, you got to allow that space for them to do the research, to allow themselves, like they want to be able to, like I see the comment, a lot of folks want to be able to say they're independent. But, you look at their voting record, you look at their turnout, they do have a tendency to kind of vote one way. But, being independent, I think one of the things we recognize is that being independent, it sounds good to be able to say it because you don't want to feel that you're tied to one party or the other,
Right.
which I know that's a topic that is pretty active in our community when we think about how do we think about our power and how do we think about having impact. So once again, it's people's prerogative to do so. And so at that point, it's really important that folks are kind of doing their research. Some cases, people are still waiting to see if some news pops up, some type of October surprise or something that maybe compels them to vote one way or another. So, once again, that's their prerogative. But I think it's really important that folks, I think the point that you're making that's valid is making sure that you're finding information from trusted resources. Because once again, as we talked about before, our community has been targeted by misinformation on purpose, right? To convince us to not vote, right? And so that's always the thing, right? It's one thing if you're, let's I think I can name this in that way. If you have one political leaning because you truly have one political leaning, then that's your prerogative, right?
Yep.
But if you are finding information that is disinformation that is telling you, don't vote, it don't matter, they're never going to give us anything, black folks are always doing this, that, and the third, that is kind of like you getting hustled because at the end of the day, participating is your fundamental right as a citizen. So if you are opting out, as we talked about earlier, you're relinquishing your power to someone else. And yes, as black people, we have legitimate gripes and we have legitimate reason to be frustrated with the system, but to opt out and to kind of fall back, you're actually keeping the status quo the way it is. And so at the end of the day, I think that's why it's important to do your research, to kind of make sure that if you're online, you're checking like where the source is. And once again, we know that we get information from a lot of different sources. We're not always checking regular news. So the internet can sometimes give us some of our talking points. I know we talked about this before, some of the think tanks, and there's some resources out there that help to kind of give you information. And so, I don't want to discredit any source, but I do think people want to be critical about what sources they're looking at to make sure that it isn't a source that is trying to get you out of your position. I think if anything, that's something to really be mindful. If you're conservative, make sure you're checking resources like the Woodson Center, or you're looking at some economic, like the Chamber of Commerce. If you're, some other organizations. If you're maybe more progressive, there may be some other organizations that you're checking in terms of policy think tanks that are advocating, like the Joint Center, or the Joint Center is more economics, Black Economic Alliance is more alliance. Even for us, like as an organization, we have policy pillars that we champion around economics, education, healthcare, housing, criminal justice, environmental justice, open and fair democracy. So thus, we can serve as a trusted messenger because at the end of the day, as a nonprofit, there are certain things that we're going to advocate for in a nonpartisan way that if you believe that we are supportive of your needs, then you can do so, right? And so then, you have your historic civil rights organizations we see in the chat. Appreciate that. And NAACP, the Urban League, the Joint Center, the other organizations that like the Black Economic Alliance, the Black Futures Lab, a lot of different entities that are trying their best and doing the work historically and currently to speak on behalf of Black people. But once again, folks have their own policy leanings, and so they may consider other resources that may be more suitable to what their interests are. So it's really important that folks do that research.
A couple points I wanted to make. One is with respect to voting, and then I want to talk more about the candidates' platforms, right? I don't want people to think, again, because maybe you do watch the news or because you might see it online, that there's a lot more um, early voting taking place now than in prior elections and so on, that like, oh, other people got it, I don't have to vote. Everybody should be voting. Everybody who's registered should be voting. Now, that's not what's going to happen because it never happens that way. But it, again, it's important that your vote is heard. And then the other thing I think people feel like is, oh, well, I don't live in a swing state, it doesn't matter. Like, I do not live in a swing state. I live in New Jersey. Well, as do you. So we already know how New Jersey's going to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just based on historical data. Like, I'm not suggesting like the fix is in, right? But there are only a select number of swing states: Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia. I don't know if they consider North Carolina a swing state.
They're looking
Um,
at, I think this election is looking like it's a swing state. Historically, it has been conservative for a number of years. I think the last time it voted for a Democrat and a president was 2008 with Obama. So it's typically been more conservative, but I think this election it's being viewed more as a swing state.
Yeah, but like Michigan, Wisconsin,
Yeah,
Arizona,
yeah,
Nevada, like uh, you should just be in the habit of doing it, right? And not thinking it doesn't matter. It matters no matter where you live.
yeah,
It especially matters in the swing states, but it matters no matter where you live. Let your voice be heard. That's all I wanted
yeah.
to add on that
No,
point.
I appreciate you bringing that up because once again, when we think about strategy, like, yes, it is your civic duty to vote. You should be voting in all election. But remember, if we're thinking about strategy and we're thinking about having impact, when you don't vote in all elections, once again, you're communicating to the campaigns that you're an infrequent voter, right? So let's give an example. Let's say you're in a district, or like right now, most um, U.S. representatives are in some states they're voting for a U.S. representative or U.S. Senate
Mhm.
to determine who's in the House and who's in the Senate. And so let's say you live in a district that there's a good chance that the Democrat is going to win. It's a heavy Democratic district. There's a good chance they're going to win, right? So then you make a calculation. Oh, that's even better. That candidate isn't running against anyone.
Mhm.
That candidate is running unopposed, so they're guaranteed to win unless no one votes for that person, right? So now you make the calculation. I bet this person's going to win anyways. I don't need to vote. And you're also seeing that the candidate isn't being aggressive and asking you to vote because they know they're going to win anyway. So in their mind, they're like, let me save my money. Let me save my time. I'm going to win anyways. So thus, I'm not going to do the to um, work to convince people to vote for me. So now, if I'm the voter and I'm seeing that energy, and then I make the calculation that, okay, I'm not going to vote anymore because this person's going to win anyways, you have to remember the next election, the campaign, whatever campaign is going to look at the voter turnout and is going to look at your voter performance. Is going to say, oh, Thomas, he skipped this vote. And then it looks like he skips votes like every so often. He's a little more inconsistent. That's going to take a little bit more work. Let me go find someone else to speak to. And so once again, that's that's why it's important that we have to think about at the end of the day, you have to vote in all elections, not because it's your civic duty, but once again, it's a feedback loop. When you vote, you're communicating to campaigns that you're a super voter. That means they're making the calculation. This person's engaged. This person pays attention. This person follows the news, so that when we do want to engage that person for future elections, we got to come correct. Versus if you don't convey that you vote in all elections, you're telling the future campaigns, he's kind of shaky, he's kind of flaky. I ain't gotta waste time with him. He may not even bang with me anyway. So why even make the effort to try to even get that person to vote? Let me just find someone else.
I want y'all to think about what he said just now like this. So imagine that you frequent a business, right? Or not even that you frequent a business, right? When you're traveling somewhere, when you're looking for a new type of category of business to patronize, right? Besides, word of mouth referrals, if you want to go to I won't say a referral is not a reputable source, But if you want to go to like a more official source, right, you might go on online and see what the reviews are for that business, right? So as Thomas said, it's a feedback loop. If nobody's ever telling you you suck, right? And
Mhm.
you really do suck, but nobody lets you know, then you just kind of keep operating, business as usual. So until somebody starts giving you a 1-star review and you get a whole bunch of 1-star reviews and your reputation online looks crappy, now you're thinking, well, I should, maybe I should try to be more responsive to what it is that these people are saying about my business. And it's the same with the politician. If you never vote, right? Or if they just kind of they they say whatever they need to say to get elected, and then they operate on whatever other agenda they might have, and come election time you're like, you know what, they're not going to do what I want them to do anyway. It doesn't matter. They're going to keep doing what they're accustomed to doing. It's your opportunity to give them a performance review. Like for those of you who work in corporate America, it's just checks and balances on their performance. Okay, so enough on that part. Let's talk more about their the party platforms, or Harris's platform and Trump's platform, um, or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, see, I told you. I mean, I might
We
be
are we are a
slightly drunk.
nonpartisan
You
organization. We are here to
partisan
just.
organization. You are a nonpartisan organization. But I'm gonna try to remain neutral. Anyway, so we can start with whichever you prefer, but kind of want to touch on what some of the main pillars of their platforms, their respective platforms are, so people are informed. But as always, I encourage you to do your own research. Um,
Yeah, we can start with former President Trump. I have it up.
okay.
In terms of his platform, he calls that Agenda 45, 47. Um, so what we see, and I think one of the things to remember, like a lot of the marketing of this election has been President Trump versus VP Harris.
Mhm.
But not only is it Trump Vance and Harris Waltz, but it's Republican administration versus Democratic administration, right? At the end of the day, it's not just Trump Harris. It's really about, okay, are you looking at who they will appoint in terms of who leads who leads all the departments in the executive branch side? If you are conservative or if you want to vote Republican, then that means you want Republican administration to kind of run government. Or if you are a Democrat, you want a Democratic administration to run the government. And so I think that's important to remember, because we sometimes get caught up in the marketing of elections that it's Trump versus Harris, or before it was Trump versus Biden. And it's not really like, yes, that's the face because they're the president, but it's administration versus administration. And so you do want to look at historically what has those types of administrations tried to pursue, and what have they historically tried to espouse in terms of their values, and then ultimately make a decision based off that, because once again, they are going to put the people in place that's going to run the government the way that they believe the citizens have asked them to do, i.e. they won the election, and so they're going to put the people in place, right? And so, what from President Trump's platform on Agenda 47, which he has on his website, he talks a lot around the border. He talks a lot around inflation. I think what we've seen is, they have, like, Republicans have some traditional talking points when they talk about free speech, when they talk about defending the Constitution, law and order. I think what I've sensed is that there is a lot of attention around like the inflation, around the border, around security and protecting neighborhoods and law and order, right? And so a lot of that can be found on their website, and also too, Republicans historically have been known around tax cuts. And so a lot of folks always think about that as a value to them. I think, there's a conversation that people can have around that in terms of, the tax cuts and who benefits and things like that. So once again, I think they tend to think about safety. They tend to think about protection. They tend to think about law and order. And then, of course, they have some of the conservative leanings that, can play a role. We've seen in this election, the abortion has been such a big topic. Trump has a success record when he thinks about what he has done related to abortion access that, that some folks can't agree with and some folks don't, right? And so, but that has been an issue that has animated a lot of people, that topic of abortion. So once again, there are some cultural issues that communities think about, and then there are economic issues, there are structural issues, et cetera, et cetera. But definitely encourage people, you definitely want to go on Trump's platform, on his website, Agenda 47, and look at what they propose, right? And so, you also have, I know there's a little bit of that separation because I know Trump hasn't, there's a lot of conversation around Project 2025. Is that Trump's plan or is that not Trump's plan? It is not Trump's plan. But once again, as we talked about before, a think tank, which is the Heritage Foundation, which is the owner of Project 2025, they are a think tank. They try to influence legislators to embrace their policy recommendations. And so they, I think this is where things are funky, right? Because the Heritage Foundation has talked about in the past that when Trump was in office, that many of the policies, like over 60% of their recommended policies was embraced by the Trump administration when he was president before. Some of that was Project 2025, some of it wasn't, but that's what they espouse as the think tank. And so, there is that conversation around, is that separate from Trump? Technically it's not. Technically it is. It is a separate document. It is recommended. It is a recommended approach. But once again, think tanks are effective because elected officials, they don't historically do the research. They tend to take the recommendations from the think tanks and from the organizations, and they get the policy recommendations from those vantage points. So for those that are concerned and those that are making the argument that Project 2025 is Trump, the way that they're conveying it is basically Trump will be given this big old binder that says Project 2025 and basically be encouraged or recommended to incorporate these recommendations. And then Trump has the decision. He could say no, he could say yes, and that's his prerogative to do so. But that is typically the rationale. And once again, there are other organizations that are think tanks that have given VP Harris her recommendations around her policies. And so once again, she has the luxury to say yes or no, but depending upon what those recommendations are. So it's important to kind of understand, to be clear about that distinction, right? Think tanks are very influential. Mm-hmm. They are separate from the campaign, but many times they can be, I guess one could say they're adjacent, right? In some cases, people that work for a think tank will be asked to work for the administration. In some cases, they'll just offer the recommendations. And so once again, it's important if you want to understand the official platform of President Trump, you do want to go to www.donaldjtrump.com, and then you can kind of research that accordingly.
Before we get into Harris's platform, I just want to remind folks that and you can have whatever partisan commentary you would like in the comments, and I'm going to address some of the comments that were raised, and Thomas, feel free to do the same. Two things I want to say. One is, and I don't want to keep kind of going back to the point about voting, but I meant to say it earlier and it just popped back up in my head. I just want you to imagine a world, right? Black people who are on this call, where you don't have the right? Not only you don't have the right, but no one has the right? Because we don't live under a democracy anymore. We live under an autocracy. We live under a dictatorship. I want you to imagine that world. So the same person keeps, getting selected into office over and over and over. And there are no elections. I want you to imagine that world. Because I'm not going to say who, but somebody did say after this cycle that there would be no more elections if they were selected. I'm not going to say who. if you want to go Google and see, it was out of that person's mouth. Okay. I just want you to imagine what that world looks like.
Well,
That's
to
all I'm going to
that point,
say.
no, and I think to that point, if we want to, if we want to take the conversation a bit further, since the Project 2025 is a plan that's quote unquote independent from Trump, we have the freedom to talk about Project 2025 independently, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not part of the campaign. So if you are someone that is concerned, you should research Project 2025 and look at it, right? And look at what it's proposing in terms of how government should function. And then think about what does that mean for Black people when we think about what are our needs and how we look, like what are our needs, where do we stand, and its implications, right? So Project 2025 talks about eliminating Department of Education. Black folks is disproportionately leverage public education, right? It talks about eliminating overtime pay. For a lot of Black folks that work 9 to 5 jobs, you're going to be impacted by the lack of overtime pay, right? And so there are other systems and recommendations that it's making that many can say will have significant impact in society overall, but more specifically on Black people when we think about how we have historically interacted with government. And so I think it's definitely, once again, because you're thinking about administration versus administration. And so if this entity that is quote unquote separate presents a potential game plan, a citizen should research it to kind of think about, is this something that could be viable for a candidate to embrace, or is the candidate going to quickly dismiss it all? I think there's, once again, if you research, you can kind of see the track record of the Heritage Foundation and how they've been able to impact the elected officials that they've interacted with. And individuals are free to make that decision in terms of what does that mean in terms of the implication to influence elected officials in the next election.
I would also like to remind folks that, regardless of who is elected, and that their party may not necessarily win in the House and Senate.
Good point.
So they do remain a check to absolute power of, of a president who may end up being elected,
Yeah,
assuming
and I think
assuming that it is, the other party. If it's the same party, then you know
yeah. No, there's that's important when we think about the executive branch and the legislative branch and how they interact and how they react with each other. So that is important to kind of keep in mind. And so at the end of the, as folks are kind of doing their research, and once again, if they're still kind of looking at it, you have to ask yourself. And I think this is some of the language that we use as an organization. We tend to say that we are looking at public. We are trying to assess the policy recommendations of public servants, right? Because these elected officials are public servants. We are trying to make sure that the policy recommendations of these public servants match the policy views that we espouse as an organization. And you all as citizens will be able to say the same. We want to look at public servants, either whoever they are, and look at what they are espousing or what they're conveying, and how does it match with your values as a citizen and who you are looking for to hire as that public servant. And so that's another way to kind of think about, even for citizens, if you want to remain nonpartisan, you want to remain neutral, you don't want to necessarily say co-sign one candidate or another, because in that example, that's you're showing partisanship. But typically you're looking at the public servants that you're trying to analyze and make sure that it matches the policy views or the values that you espouse as an individual or that we espouse as an organization.
One final point I want to make before we get into Harris's platform, is that I was researching kind of what are the priority issues, amongst American citizens, and because this came up in a prior sort of unfiltered discussion I had on on politics, unplanned. And the economy is always and typically first, and that's still the case. I was looking at a Gallup poll. I mean, you probably might find variations depending on what source you're looking at, but I think that's probably going to be number one across most polling data. Was the economy, It was democracy, national security, or I should say preserving democracy and national security concerns. The third was Supreme Court justices, and because the next president will likely have the opportunity to appoint new Supreme Court justices. Um, Following that, I believe was immigration. Um, I think it could have been gun policy. I don't know if gun policy or abortion was next, but again, generally the economy is at the top of the priority list. So
But it's
um
interesting, even when you bring that up, because I think that shows sometimes, to a certain extent, the inconsistency of citizens, right? Because there is, what we see a lot of times, and I think 2022 is a perfect example. In 2020, when we think about President Biden when he won, is that many folks will say it's the economy, but what really drives them ends up being something more emotional or visceral, right? And so it's like, so sometimes that data can be interesting because it's like, it sounds good to say the economy. If someone's interviewing me, I'm probably going to say the economy because it sounds informed when you say that. But what gets people really emotional ends up being like the abortion or immigration or another topic, right? And so that just speaks to the fact that, like, what may drive you intellectually may not always translate what drives you emotionally to actually vote and actually be involved and to actually be engaged. So,
mhm.
I think it's always interesting in those data points because there is some validity. I think one of the things we see in this current climate is the language around inflation and things being expensive and kind of this disconnect, right? If you speak to an economist, they will tell you this economy is humming, this economy is good. Look at all the indications. Like, you look at your 401k and you look at all of these, look at the unemployment rate, all of these things. Like, if someone was to study it, they would say these things look great. But then if you holler at someone around the way, they may say, nah, this economy is trash. Eggs are expensive, or whatever language that they may say. And so once again, it becomes this interesting dynamic of like is like economically, are we good because as a society are we good and overall, or are we not good because of how we may perceive it to not be good, or are we actually having an honest conversation around, are we actually good? Because if unemployment is low, that means everyone is working. Someone could say that's good, but then someone could say, oh, nah, I got 2 jobs. I don't want that. I just want one job and I want to make a lot of money. So because I don't have that, I don't think the economy is good. So once again, I think these topics can always be tricky because it's really about the perception and how you analyze your lot in life, and thus how do you compare that with historical trends and the current landscape, right? African American unemployment is at the lowest it's ever been. So, one could look at that as a positive. But,
One could.
people are comparing, some other factors. So at the end of the day, I think that's always something that people got to think about.
One of the factors, and I swear we're going to get into Harris's platform in just a minute, but one of the factors that was raised, which I think I keep seeing people sort of refer back to as a talking point, is, I know the pandemic seems like, uh, a very long time ago when in fact it really wasn't. And, Trump gave us stimulus checks. He gave you stimulus checks that were approved by Congress, a Democratic Congress. You might not have got those stimulus checks if the Democratic Congress didn't approve it because he didn't want to. But when it was approved and it came to his desk, then he wanted to make sure he signed his name on it. And why did you get a stimulus check? You got a stimulus check because the economy was like tanked because of the pandemic. And they were trying to spur on, you know, consumerism during the pandemic, right? So you're not just because they're not just going to be giving away money like that. That's not how this works. So I just, as a reminder, I just need to remind people it was $1,200. Also, nobody's getting rich off of $1,200. And then I know people were some people were taking out PPP loans. Some people probably regret taking out them PPP loans now because maybe they were not done by legitimate means. And so I'm just saying, you feel like money was flowing because we were in a pandemic and they were trying to stimulate the economy in some way during that time frame, right? And a lot of people couldn't work and yada yada yada. So I just wanted to remind you folks of that. Moving on to Harris's platform. Anyway.
No, that's it. And to be honest, that speaks to folks understanding government, right? You have the executive branch that will propose something. They may have these ideas as to what they want, but it's the legislative branch that will actually pass the legislation that needs to be approved. And then, yes, the president signs it if he or she agrees with that as well. But there is that separation between what the executive branch does suggest, unless they do something by executive order. But most times you want things done by the legislative branch that gets signed by the executive branch because there's more stability in that legislation or in that in that.
Okay, I just want to respond to some of these comments because you know, I have folks on here who are sort of representing both sides, although I see it's kind of more leaning in a particular direction. But Mr. Buddha Tom, if I'm mispronouncing your name, my apologies. But I'm just curious as to who you think is stating opinions, or are you talking about the people in the comments? Because you ain't talking about us. You ain't talking about my expert. No, I mean, listen, your opinion, your perspective, we are not telling you how to vote. We are just giving you information, and maybe they are in the comments, but we are just giving you information, and you should continue to do your own research, right? But take the information, compare it with what you're getting online or in the news or whatever, and make your choice accordingly. It depends on what's important to you, but I don't think it's fair to say that, so your statements are facts and everybody else is an opinion. I don't think that's fair to say. So I'm not trying to single you out. It's just I just read what you said there, so I wanted to address it. Now, Harris's platform, go.
Okay. Now you got me in the comments looking back to see like who said what. So let me get back to the top. So when we look at, you can go to KamalaHarris.com. You can read some of the issues. I know her tagline says a new way forward. She seems to kind of be leaning in a lot around the middle class in terms of thinking about lower costs and creating opportunity. There's information around. She talks about cutting taxes for working people, lowering food costs. So it seems like, lowering healthcare costs. So a lot of what she talks about is like lowering costs. And so there's a lot there in terms of energy costs, prescription costs, healthcare costs. And then she talks a lot around the economy, like opportunity. I know people saw she talked about this opportunity agenda that looks at giving a tax credit for a small business, potentially giving a tax credit for someone that wants to buy a home, a tax credit for someone that wants to start a small business. And then, of course, I know, the abortion thing is a big topic that I think Democrats have leaned into as well. And so there's language around Roe versus Wade, and there's some distinctions between what Republicans view Roe versus Wade versus what Democrats view Roe versus Wade. But, a lot of what we see, at least in terms of the headlines, her sections are kind of clear. It says lower costs for middle class families, and then build an opportunity economy that helps Americans get ahead. And so, and then, I know most recently she's proposed an agenda that speaks to Black men. That's their hope of trying to, speak to men around some of the needs that they have. And so, those are things that you can definitely see on their website. And once again, as you're doing your research, you do want to think about what are the values that you espouse and how do they match with the recommendations that are being offered. Another way to kind of think about too is, especially if you're someone that's in this advocacy space, is which is the administration that you're able to push towards your ideal, right? And so that's what a lot of advocacy organizations look at. They look at, okay, who has been, even if both candidates haven't been the great on issue X. Who has been closer, or who can we get closer to where we want to be? And so some people will make a decision based off of that because they're going to look at, you know, yes, both candidates could be not great on this one issue, but one candidate and their administration is a little bit better than another candidate in their administration. So maybe if we can get that candidate, if we put that candidate in, then we can get them closer to our desired outcome. So I think that's something to think about as well. And in some cases, you may be looking at some of the success or some of the achievements that were done in the previous administration and look and see, is that a continuation or is that going to be a separation, right? Like, yes, Harris was vice president under President Biden, but there's limitations that she has as a vice president. She can't come in and tell Biden, like, you need to listen to me. Typically, it's the other way around. She's working at the pleasure of the President Biden, right? And so there's going to be some instances where these are accomplishments that are Biden-Harris, but it's under the purview of Biden's vision. And, VP Harris was probably there to assist. But then if she is to win, she may continue some of those things and build upon it, or she may encourage some other recommendations based on what she personally believes is necessary. So once again, I think it's important to kind of think about when you think about healthcare, right? I think one of the examples is like under this administration, they passed legislation around diabetes health, like cost of diabetes medicine, and how cheap it is for certain population of people. There's been language around trying to extend that a bit, right? So that's an example of, hey, that's an idea that we believe was good. We're going to continue it, or we're going to expand it so that more people can get access to it. And then there's maybe a policy that President Harris may decide, VP Harris, if she wins, she may pivot a bit. And so once again, it's always important that you go into both of those candidates' websites and kind of researching what they're proposing. Once again, think about the people that they will put in place to potentially implement the policies that we're proposing. In some instances, they may not be able to accomplish everything because, once again, they're the executive branch. And so if Congress is not an ideal partner, then their agenda may not be as successful. So you do have to factor that in play. But at the same time, when you are assessing, you're trying to think about what are the values that what are the values that I believe in, what are the things that matter to me, and how do they match with the proposals that are being proposed, recognizing that no candidate is going to give you 100% because no candidate is going to be equal. If you want 100%, you need to run for office, right?
Exactly.
At the end of the day.
Yeah. I wanted to emphasize that point, like that, I think, again, you can't you can't play a hate on the sideline. Like my girl Kim said, get your own ish while you riding line, right? You got to get out there, get out and get something and let your voice be heard, because nobody cares. Nobody wants to listen to you. Like, people will complain regardless, right? But people who take the time to vote, and not just in a presidential election, who are civically engaged. So we're going to pivot to that discussion momentarily, but who are invested, who are engaged, who hold their politicians and civic leaders accountable, are going to get the most response. As well as, because this is a point we didn't touch on, listen, funding matters, right? We didn't touch on that. Damn, there was something else I wanted to mention related to what you were saying, but I lost that point. Maybe it'll come back to me. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on the platform before we pivot to
Yeah, I think that is something to think about when we think about, once again, it goes back to administration. We think about, will they fund programs or initiatives that speak to our community and our needs? Will they fund certain departments? What does it mean if a department is not funded well, or if a department is funded well, how does that translate in terms of the services that we need? And then also, I think the civil rights aspect, right? You got to think about some of our protections when we think about, um, you know, civil rights and the ability to sue if an entity is not doing right by us as a community. There's a lot of different things that you can look at in the previous in previous administrations to analyze to determine if it makes sense for you as a citizen. And I know for us as an organization, where a lot of what we think about is, once again, thinking about economic self-sufficiency for Black people, so moving Black people into the middle class and beyond. We're thinking about our aspirations, we're thinking about our protection, right? So we think about the importance of voting, making sure that Black folks, in New Jersey, has the ability to vote, and that there's no restrictions in that regard. We're thinking about home ownership. How do we help more Black people move into the middle class? Typically, it's been home ownership as a way to do that. If Black folks want to open a small business, how do we how are we supporting that? I know in New Jersey there's been a lot of issue around that issue, where a lot of Black minority businesses are not getting access to contracts from the government, right? And so that's an implication, because if you're not getting access to capital, how can you grow your business? And so then at the end of the day, you can't feed your family, you can't provide for your community, things like that. So once again, healthcare, I know for a lot of women, I don't even say women, I want to make sure I name that right, because maternal health can sometimes get labeled as a women thing, as if I don't have a wife, right? And so at the end of the day, men need to, maternal health is an issue that everyone should care about, because it matters if a woman is delivering and then she passes away because of a complication of health. That's something we need to think about. And as a man, we need to be concerned about that. And at the same time, I have my own health issues that I need to be cognizant of. And I need to make sure that there's a government that's going to respond to the policy needs that I have as a man. So once again, I think it's those, as an organization, these are things that we think about in the work that we do. But everyone in the audience, they got to ask themselves, if they're associated with an organization, what are the values that they're advocating for? Or as an individual citizen, how do you want your government to work?
Don't forget, not just the wives, your mamas, your
Yeah.
daughters, your aunties, your cousins, and them, all of them, right? Like, some of these policies are so restrictive, right? Because people just think, oh, people are being irresponsible, with their sexual activity, and just using abortion as birth control. Sometimes, there may be an issue with the pregnancy. I just saw John Legend was on Club Shay Shay, talking about how his wife had to have an abortion at, I mean, it was like kind of advanced into her pregnancy, because there was some sort of complication. So it's like you're having to choose between, the life of your wife, or, mom, or whomever the woman is, and the baby potentially. Like, you have to be practically on your deathbed. Like, who now, imagine, forget about abortion, right? Imagine you go to a hospital, and for some reason the doctor's telling you, well, I can't operate you, and you're like halfway to the upper room. What? Like, I can't even fathom them not providing you the care, to the whatever care that you need. It's just, anyway, but I'm going off on a tangent. So before I get specific and
Well,
in
to
the
that point,
weeds.
that's one of the parts of the plan is the research, right? And so when we think about building your plan, going back to what we talked about, you know, you want to make sure you know where you're going to vote. You want to make sure you know if you're going to vote early or in person. You want to research the candidates. And so once again, that you can make sure that you're making an informed vote, that you're voting down the ballot. You're looking at all the positions versus, local, state, federal. There's some school boards, there's some city council, like whatever your ballot looks like, you want to make sure that you're able to do so. And, for us at NJ Beck, you can go on our website and you can find resources there to research the candidates.
Oh man, there was one other point I wanted to make before we talked about what else you can do to remain civically engaged. You've touched on some of these points throughout the conversation. So, but I do want to just kind of I would like you to reiterate what folks can do to remain civically engaged. Oh, but this one point I did want to make related to what we were just discussing. Please, people, be realistic in your expectations. these people are not like they can't wave a magic wand and give you everything you want. Like it's a genie in a bottle and you rub it and you get all your wishes. That's not how this works. Like the Democrats and Harris representing the Democrats are a party like the big tent party, right? So they have a whole bunch of different constituencies that they are attempting to be responsive to, right? So that means, and once again, the people who the squeakiest wheel, right? Those are the people they're going to pay the most attention to. So because they're trying to respond to all these different priorities and asks and whatever, then you just have to consider what can realistically be done in the course of a 4-year administration, right? Particularly if you don't have um, Congress, like a Democratic Congress, along with your Democratic executive branch, versus a party who is responding to a very specific or seemingly responding to a very specific constituency. They're not trying to sort of gain new voters, or at least that's not my personal perception. I think they're very invested and embedded with their base of support and counting on them to, you know, vote them back into office. Again, that's my own personal opinion. I know this is supposed to be nonpartisan, but I just wanted to add that too. 2 cents. So finally, final thoughts on how you can remain civically engaged post the election.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that this election, like voting happens in many cases twice a year, every year. But beyond just voting, right? Like there's once you're, for instance, in New Jersey, the governor is going to propose a budget in February, late February. Typically, that budget is how they plan to spend our tax dollars. At that point, you can go as a citizen to a hearing, or you can connect with an organization that will allow you to go testify as to how that government and how the legislators should ultimately how they should spend that money by how they vote to pass the budget, right? And so I guess another way to say it, the governor's going to propose a budget. The state legislators are going to do their deliberation. They're going to analyze the recommendations. Then they're gonna basically approve the budget. And so then as citizens, we can begin to advocate for them to spend more money on this, to not spend money on this, however you may feel. So there's ways that you could be involved in that way, right? There's also, as they always say, all politics is local. And so, there's school boards, there's city council meetings. One of the things that COVID has provided is an opportunity to watch a lot of these meetings virtually. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to like go downtown and deal with traffic or whatever. You can be home, you can eat your food and watch city council participate. You can participate in school boards and kind of just monitor what's happening locally, right? You can also begin to join certain commissions. And so those commissions, like many of the departments will have a commission. And sometimes the commission can be on a specific topic that may be of your interest. So then you can begin to lend your expertise as to how these commissions should operate. Excuse me. And many times their commissions have access to the legislator. So once again, there's a lot of different ways you can plug in. For some of you, you may be more religious in nature. So you may want to be more on the advocacy and helping folks out. I know for us, like for instance, next Friday, shameless plug, we're doing a webinar where we're talking to pastors and religious leaders about the importance of policy in the pulpit, right? Most religious organizations are nonpartisan, but they're still thinking about policy and what are the policies that matter to their community. So definitely, if you follow us, it's going to be 10 a.m., but when we have the details posted, you'll see it on our IG page. But once again, there's a lot of different ways you can plug in. You can plug in with a local NAACP chapter and a local Urban League chapter. You could be on a board of a local nonprofit. Let's say as a person, I'm passionate around reentry and justice involved individuals. I may decide, okay, I work as an accountant, so I just do accounting things, but I really care about justice involved individuals. So I'm going to join a local nonprofit that's working with that population and cut a check to support that work, right? So that at the end of the day, if that organization is doing great work, then you will be helping to sustain that organization through your philanthropy or through your money. And so once again, there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of plug in. I think another way to think about is really one of the recommendations I would make is where you live, you should on your social media not only follow some of the advocacy organizations that speak to your interests. So once again, if you're someone that's passionate around reentry and justice involved individuals, you should be following organizations that are advocating for policies that you believe in, right? So that you can stay informed based on the organizations that are doing the work that you believe need to be done. In addition, you should follow the mayor of your city, the city council person that represents you, the governor, the legislator that represents you, the president, and the congress people that represent you. You should have them on your social media feed so that you can see the type of things that they're doing. And if you see that they're moving kind of sloppily, you should contact them, right? One of the tools that we don't use a lot in our community is literally emailing your legislator and tell them, my name is Thomas. I am your constituent. When you say, I am your constituent, that's you saying, hey, yo, I'm your boss, right?
Yes.
I, I am your constituent. I have a concern about X, Y, and Z, or I am your constituent. I actually want you to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New Jersey. I think it's important because of X, Y, and Z. Why is that important? Legislators, every Monday morning or every few days, they will ask their staff, hey, staffer, who called me
Yep.
and what issue,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
so then if I'm the staffer and, and I am told, okay, who called? I have to say, Thomas called me about this. Becky called me about this. Keisha called me about this. Hakeem called me about, like, they got to keep track of
Yep.
that. And why is that important? That lets them kind of sense, okay, is this issue bubbling up or is this an issue that ain't really that deep, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if they can tell that an issue is bubbling up, then they're going to have to respond because then they're going to make the calculation, all right, this issue is kind of bubbling up. If I don't say anything, people are going to end up reacting to the fact that I ain't saying anything. And so then I got to do something, whatever I choose to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so once again, and that's important because we'll see our elected officials in the community. We'll see them at like different forums. We'll see them at the community day. And we may say, okay, let me go talk to them then at that point. And yes, they're going to talk to you because you're their constituent, et cetera, et cetera. But they may not officially calculate what you're asking them to do or what your complaint is because they're enjoying a cheesesteak or they're talking to the community or whatever, right? Like
Right.
they may not be fully engaged like you
Right.
think. But when you call them, that's you giving them receipts,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so as we know, we care about the receipts. So when you can show them, hey, I've called you a few times.
Oh, they
This
don't
is what I
like
complain.
that.
And at the same time, they have to respond. Like they have to notify you that they received your communication. So once again, when we talk about keeping the receipts, you can actually show them, I've called you, I've emailed you 5 times on this issue. I haven't seen a response. This seems like you're ignoring this issue. I would hate to believe that you don't think this is important. Maybe we got to think about we got to think about your performance and maybe think about putting someone else in place. Like you may not say all that, but that's the
Oh,
calculation that they're
no.
making.
Some people definitely say all that. So the point is, and I understand that, like, a lot of folks who follow me are, within an age where they're still, working, whether it's your own business or working for the man, right? So you might not have time to sit and draft a bunch of emails and letters. I mean, hey, chat GPT, right?
Mhm.
um get your neighbors. If to Thomas's point, if you follow, some of these advocacy groups, and it's an issue that's important to you, um as he mentioned, when they start seeing a lot of chatter bubbling around a particular topic of conversation impacting their constituency, then they want to go to the source to try to figure out how to resolve it, because they don't want, like, nobody wants to keep dealing with fires and problems, but that's part of your job in that role. So to the extent that you can not only appear to be addressing the issue, but to the extent that you can make tangible impacts that benefit your constituents, then they're more inclined to be like, you know what, that's my guy. And then you have, politicians who are in office for years and years and years because they are very engaged with their constituencies. But for the people who don't, who don't care, they don't pay attention. Oh, they don't care about me. They don't care about you because you don't care. You don't care about ish,
Mhm.
or you don't appear to care. You only sit on the sidelines complaining.
Yeah, you have to react, or you have to be active in the mechanisms that elected officials respond to. So an example, let's say I live in, in Jersey. I live in Camden, right? And there's an issue in Camden, but I'm complaining to someone that is in Newark. The
Right.
first thing that elected official is going to say is, that ain't my that may not be my problem,
Mm-hmm.
because that's not my
Mm-hmm.
constituent. I have to respond to the constituents, the people that call me, the people that vote me in. Now, in some instances, depending upon the issue, it could matter to me in Newark, depending upon who I am as an elected official. If I'm an state elected official, then yes, maybe something in Camden matters, right? But typically, elected officials are going to first respond to the issues that um, that that are in their district, that are the issues that are being presented, or the things that are being presented by their constituents, the people that can actually vote them in or out. And so that's why it's important to kind of always know who's your elected officials and be engaged with them, because their first responsibility is to the people that can vote them in or out. And so that's why it's important. Like, for instance, an example, let's say there's a protest and 1,000 people show up. Most times, the first thing the elected official is going to say is, and those are some troublemakers. Those are not my constituents. That's someone from another state. They just came here to cause trouble. But let's say that same protest, you had data to show 85% of attendees lived in the zip code blah 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can go back to that legislator and say, nah, hold up. I can prove to you 85% of our attendees live in your district. Here's their zip code.
Mm-hmm.
Now that elected official is like, oh snap, like those are my potential
Yep.
voters. I got to figure out what to do. Do I stand with them? Do I meet with them? Do I disagree with them? Whatever they may decide to do. But ultimately recognize that they're going to react to numbers that show them this issue matters to my constituents. I need to respond accordingly.
The final point I just want to reemphasize is that not only do they care about your squeaky wheel, they care about
The money.
they care about this, where them dollars at, right? So if an issue is a priority to you, it's important to you. Obviously, I'm not saying you're buying um them or their attention, right? But they're prioritizing who's helping to fund them getting in office, because most of these candidates are not independently wealthy and can fund a whole campaign without contributions from,
Yeah.
from
No, and that's
potential and
real,
prospective
especially
voters.
when we look at black legislators. I know a lot of times there's a lot of research that talks about the fact that, like, we that a lot of black electeds don't always have a lot of money to fund their campaigns, so then they have to be responsible to other stakeholders. And I think that's an example of why our community needs to be tapped in and really pay attention, right? Because if you vote someone in and then you believe that they're not that they've changed, many times it's because they're reacting to the people or the motivation that can help them stay in office. And a lot of times that motivation is money. And right. And so then at the end of the day, you can be you can have a lot of money, but if you don't have a lot of votes, then money doesn't always win, right? We've seen plenty of examples where someone with less money won because they had the votes. And so in our community, yes, we are growing our wealth, but we still have many individuals that don't have a lot of money. By voting, that's your way to potentially combat the fact that you may not have a lot of money, right? Because at the end of the day, one person could have $1,000 and then another candidate could get $1,001 bills from 1,000 citizens. If those supporters vote, the candidate got 1,000 votes. Yep. Versus the one candidate that maybe, yes, they cut a big check, but they still count as one vote. And that's always important to remember. One vote is one vote is one vote. If you're poor, if you're middle class, if you're wealthy, one vote is one vote is one vote. And so that's why we really stress the importance of being super voters, because that's your way of potentially counteracting the fact that you may not have a lot of money to cut a check to support candidates.
And there it is. So with that said, I thank you once again, Thomas, for joining me this evening.
No doubt, no doubt.
About this very, very, very important topic. Again, I know some of y'all don't do politics, but whether you do it or not, it's gonna do you. You are impacted if you care or if you don't. And so please consider, if you're still on the fence, right? If you're undecided and you're registered, right? If you're not registered, there may still be an opportunity you need to investigate depending where you live. But if you're not registered, it could potentially be too late for some of you. If you are, please don't let your vote go to waste. Please really consider whose platform and positions and policies overall align with, your personal ideology, your personal perspective, whatever is important to you and your family. Don't just think about yourself, right? If you have a family, think about how this person's positions affect your family as well. And I thank you. And so
yeah, November 5th.
We gonna see.
Yeah. November 5th is election day. Make sure you're prepared to vote. If you plan to vote early, make sure you do so. If you're ready, if you're going to vote in person, make sure you do so November 5th. Once again, really appreciate you giving us an opportunity to kind of wrap and, talk about this important topic, and more importantly, hopefully inspire all of us that have the ability to be involved to kind of lean in. I think one of the things I always want to tell people is that, like, sometimes in this advocacy space, we can sometimes make the impression that, like, you have to be Dr. King or Malcolm X to be involved, right?
Yep.
And that can be like daunting. And so because of that, we end up being like, nah, forget that. I can't meet that. I can't meet that expectation, right? But I think everyone should ask themselves, like, all right, if my advocacy is a 1, how do I take it to a 2? If I'm at a 2, how do I take it to a 3, right? Because there's some folks that they do this thing, right? And their advocacy is at a 10 or their advocacy is at a 9. But if you can have more people go from like stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 4, then that allows the people that are at stage 9 to get to stage 10, right? Because one of the issues that exists is the folks that are doing the work, they get burnt out. And then all of us are just on the sideline watching. Mm-hmm. And then we're mad that that person is not involved in the fight anymore. And it's like, I looked back and none of y'all were rocking with me. So I had to take care of myself, right? And so at the end of the day, yep. I think this, if anything, what we really are trying to inspire in our community is, regardless of how you think about this issue, regardless of how you want to be involved, how do you lean in, how do you tap in, use the skill sets that you have to add value around advocacy for fighting for the needs that you believe are important for your community, so that, at the end of the day, we are all responsible for the future and we're all doing our part. And so once again, make sure you follow us on NJBEC_. And as I mentioned, next Friday at 10 a.m., we're going to be doing an interesting conversation around religion and policy and how folks that are religiously inclined can be more in tune with policy and how they see the connection between those two. We invite you all to join us for that conversation.
You heard him. Go follow him at NJBEC_. So you can learn all about the great advocacy. I can't talk. Work that they are doing. That's NJ Black Empowerment Coalition. Thank you, Thomas.
No doubt, no doubt.
Have a
We'll
great
see you on the other
we'll
side,
see you
right? As
Sunday.
they say,
Well,
we'll see you on the other side.
yeah, so on the other side, indeed.
No doubt, no doubt. Have a good one.
You too. Um, so folks, my parting words, once again, the power is in our hands collectively, right? Don't make your ancestors proud, right? Get to the polls and vote your conscience, vote your priorities, but most importantly, just vote. Power to the people. I'll see y'all next Wednesday. I'm out. These two fingers.